the conscious. The goal is to raise the consciousness and the engagement of the larger community to address the abandonment that had happened to the city over a long period of time. And it's that systematic abandonment of the urban core, people of color, that all of our systems are to address now. So that's some of the background and the why. And almost so CLNE began, excuse me, in March of 2000, just before the pandemic was announced. And then after CLNE started during a pandemic, then 3 months later was the murder of George Floyd. So it's in that context that we entered into a virtual world and how to move forward. And one of the things that happened out of that was we were blessed to have a campaign during the Derek Chauvin trial, and we named it Healing Our City, which was a partnership with Don and Sandra Samuels, Krista Tippett, and a number of leaders that became not only a national, but an international opportunity of convening to provide an experience of community in the midst of all of that disruption. So that's some of the background to CLNE. And maybe Dan, you can say more about Healing Our City. That's kind of one of the ways that I, like Diane, I was one of the many, almost 2,000 people that participated in that as a convening that went on for 79 consecutive days from 8 to 8:30. And I'm really tossing this to you, Dan, but how that fits into our topic for this evening.
Sure. I'm going to, I'll bring in Healing Our City, but first I want to share with you just who we are as a team. This is a slide that shows our staff, which has grown since PK started the organization back in 2020. We've got a bunch of gifted people, and I think what I've known about PK is he gathers up people based on their gifts and their passions, and once they get here, then we figure out how it might play into our mission overall. And I mentioned the work we do with faith communities and with church groups. The other part of what we do is we work directly with communities, with particularly in North Minneapolis, where we've got roots. As you know, PK pastored Redeemer Lutheran Church there, and there are a number of congregations there in North Minneapolis that share the mission that Redeemer had to serve the neighborhood, not just the people that go to the church. And so our staff is now, we're growing our staff in order to be able to do more with the youth and with families that are part of North Minneapolis and be a part of that. And so those two audiences together, the faith communities in the metro area and the community members in North Minneapolis, there's a mutual benefit down the road, although sometimes it's best to work with those communities separately. So let me share. PK talked a bit about Healing Our City. That was how I met Diane and a lot of other people. Some of you may know, might remember this vividly, when the trial for Derek Chauvin was ready to happen, was getting ready. And Don Samuels, who's a community leader, you might know him, he had originally organized the Healing Our City with actual prayer tent on West Broadway. And then a year later, it was quite a healing event. It was, I'll say healing, it was a space. It was a prayerful space where people could go and just be in silence, sit in silence, and mark the amount of time that George Floyd had Officer Chauvin's knee on his neck, and to mark that time with silence and reflection. And that provided a real space for people to come and do what they needed to do. So a year later, when the trial was beginning, the question was posed, like, well, what do we do now? It seems like there ought to be something to do. And so CLNE, we partnered with Don and with Sandra, and as it turned out, a host of other leaders to put together this virtual prayer tent, because we're still under the pandemic. And so as PK said, every day, starting with the beginning of jury selection, all the way through the first year marking of George Floyd's murder, we had a prayer time in the morning. And we had a variety of actually a huge, rich variety of speakers who would come and just share 10 minutes of their reflection. And we prioritize people of color, leaders of color, people of different faiths and of no faith, because it really wasn't it was a place of prayer and space and silence. But our intent was to show there's a universality to all of us as we're coming together. We're holding space for peace and for healing. And what I'm showing here on this slide is just a handful of the videos that we've got, these reflections of people like Naacp Levy Armstrong. She's a local person. Krista Tippett. She really opened up things and used her network to bring some leaders into our circle. So it was a blessing to be a part of that, because of what it really did was showcase a space where diverse leaders could share their voices around something that was so important and so, real and tangible for people every single day. And we continue to get people sharing how much that time meant to them. And so I think that set us up to that kind of let us know that virtual was a legitimate platform. And so, not unlike you all, we decided we could do a monthly program. We call it Come Together for Racial Justice. And so we took a few months in the summer off, but starting next week, we're going to be having a session on Thursday evenings. And it's the point of Come Together for Racial Justice is to lift up BIPOC leaders so that the people who attend, there's some overlap with the people who attended the Healing Our City sessions, can hear from voices that they would not normally hear from, and hear perspectives they would not normally hear from. And honestly, that is a key element to this cultural competence growing, this cultural development, is to listen to and prioritize listening to voices that we're not used to hearing. So it begins with listening and paying attention to who we listen. How many of the faces and voices that we hear are white people, are people of a certain demographic, certain income level or education level, and just to be aware that that's only one perspective, and there are many others that are valuable. So Come Together, our very first sessions, we had Paul Slack and Jody Harpstead, who BK mentioned. They were a great back and forth because they actually did a lot of work together to build bridges and to create a program called Come Together. And then this next week, we've got some young leaders who are just recently joined our staff, but they're going to give us the youth perspective from Minneapolis, and we're looking forward to hearing them next week. How we doing, PK?
How's that? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great. Much better. Yeah.
Oh, great. So
I think it would help, Brother Chapman, if we could see your face a little bit better.
Oh,
We there you go.
well, I don't hear that very often.
Yeah, you're a good looking person, PK.
I'd like to see your face. Thank you. That's better. Thank you.
Well, Dan, maybe if you can take down the slide.
Yep.
Thank you. So one of the reasons that we're beginning with those two programs is strategically, we believe in the value of relationship. And that when we talk about transcending the boundaries, investing in relationship, and in many ways, that means going at the pace of relationship. So we'll be talking about that, and you'll hear that as a thread. And the reason for Healing Our City Come Together is in the intention of featuring a BIPOC or person of color as the reflection leader. So it's particularly in Minnesota, there's so many places and spaces where Black and brown people, diversity doesn't really come together. And so hearing voices that people may not typically hear. And so remembering that as a thread, that relationship as a means of moving forward and transcending the boundaries and systems that we either set up or have inherited. So with that relationship, what we've discovered in the first 3 years of CLNE is that thinking about the murder of George Floyd, all of the disruption that gone on, not only in Minnesota, but across our nation, is that we have work to do. And that the analysis that we have is that for more than 400 years, Black and brown people have said racism is a problem. And by and large, the white community has not really paid much attention to that. And then during the disruption that occurred of the murder of George Floyd, Philando Castile, Breonna Taylor, on and on and on, there's this awakening of awareness within the larger dominant white community. And so the challenge that we see at CLNE and all of our organizations is there needs to be a bridge to create the relationship where people come together, and particularly people that have not felt that they've been heard, experiencing that they are being heard, and people that feel that they're not being seen, experiencing that they are being seen. And so the work, whether you're talking about CLNE or the League of Women Voters or whatever corporation it might be, it really is about how do we mitigate some of the disparities that have been institutionalized in our organizations. And that our belief is people are not likely to join or affiliate with our organizations and our systems if they don't feel that they're really being heard or that they're really being seen. And so that's part of the I guess the theory of change that we're functioning out of with CLNE. So when you think about this, and I invite you to think about how organizations and systems have emerged in our society. So when you think about education, there's a sign of that disparity. Brown and the Board of Education as one symbol of that. The disparity in education in certain communities. And you think about policing and thinking about things like racial profiling and the stigmatization and the disparities in our legal system. Or if you think about finance and the history of redlining in our society, in our culture, or you think about housing in our society, those are all systems that some benefit at the expense of others. You can add to that literature and how some people are depicted in literature over the history of our country and some are elevated. Or healthcare is yet another where you think about things that have emerged, like hopefully you are familiar with the Tuskegee Institute. So all of those institutions that some of us have the benefit of and have a sense of trust and expectation of service, and yet others have grown to be distrustful of all of those institutions because they have not been places that really have merited trust. And I have to add to that one, voting is yet another institution that has not garnered that trust. That until was in 1965, that certain people could not vote. So when you think about those systems and those that we all live with, and as we look at, well, now how do we build equity into those systems? That's a question and a challenge that we all have. Not to just think of that as our individual, siloed organization, but that's a systemic wide challenge that in naming racism or white supremacy, and that how that is impacting all of our organizations, all of our systems. And so when we aspire to bring equity into those systems, there's relationship work that we all have to do, and building trust with one another. And also part of that trust is also the opportunity and the challenge that empowering those people that are coming from communities that have been disenfranchised to also be a part of the voice in the face of our organizations as we're inviting others in. There's something that we really do to called, there's a Dr. Edwin Nichols who talks about worldviews. Dr. Nichols talks about in the United States that we operate out of three basic worldviews. Dr. Nichols talks about in the experience of African American, Native American, and Hispanic people, that the dominant operative worldview is relationship. So how I feel in relationship to my neighbor, how I feel in relationship on my world, my job, is fundamental to how I feel about myself as an African American, Native American, Hispanic person in the worldview in the United States. And Dr. Nichols is very clear to say that one worldview is not better than another worldview. And then Dr. Nichols starts to talk about in the United States, the worldview for Asian Pacific Island people, that the dominant worldview is following the emperor, speaking with one voice, respect for the elder, conformity. So, and again, one worldview is not better than another worldview, but we see what that core value for African American, Native American, Hispanic people being relationship, for Asian Pacific Islander persons in the United States being respect for the elder, speaking with one voice. And then again, one worldview is not better than another worldview. But then Dr. Nichols talks about for people from Western European background, people that we identify as white, that the dominant worldview is acquisition of object. So when he talks about acquisition of object, he talks about things like how much do you make? How much do you know? And a big one that I always think about is the commodity of time. How much time do you have? So the challenge is one worldview not being better than another worldview. But in the operation and the history of the United States, it's one worldview being superior to other worldviews. And so when you think about the values and our system and our organizations being adhering to that those particular worldviews, if each of those worldviews is not incorporated or valued, then that sets up a system that kind of leads us to where we are today. So whether you're talking about a church or policing or the League of Women's Voters, or not, excuse me, not the League of Women's Voters, but voting systems. Look at how those systems are executed, right? And so how are the values incorporated and or the leadership and the voice of those different worldviews? And I would say a challenge, whether you're talking about the church or voting systems, or how it goes far as say the League of Women Voters, how do we incorporate those various worldviews in the ways that we communicate, in the ways that we embrace leadership, in the ways that we that people and there are seen and heard? And that, because the challenge with that is that if you have to fit into a worldview that is not honoring your worldview, then the way that one becomes seen and heard is to assimilate into the dominant culture. That's a huge challenge because so many people, in order to be seen and heard, in order to be valued, in order to receive the benefits of our organizations, means that if you have to assimilate and fit into another culture, a dominant culture, then at a certain point, you say, is it worth it? And so to be more practical about this. So for CLNE or for the church or for the League of Women Voters, when we say we want to have people from the African American community participate in CLNE programming, if the only way that we invite them are ways that reflect a worldview that is not their worldview, and the example of a worldview of acquisition, then then the way that we would typically send out information would be simply to send out an email or a letter. And the challenge is, if I'm just saying white, excuse me, if I'm from the dominant or white culture, and I value acquisition of object, then what I'm going to put in my letter that people want to know, they're going to know what time is the meeting. They're going to know what will be the point of the meeting. They want to know like the data for the meeting. And then compare that to, let's say, an African-American, Latino, Hispanic community. They might want to know, well, will there be food at the meeting? They might want to know, well, who will be at the meeting? So there are different kind of core values reflecting one's worldview, culture. And the example of, let's say, Hmong, Asian Pacific Islander, what I would want to do in sending out the communication is a letter to the elder, some way to elevate that the elder is the one who will be there and validates the meeting or the clan. So those are some of the examples, and think of how do we begin to think, for hundreds of years in the United States, we've really communicated out of a kind of a mono value system that reflects a dominant worldview of a European kind of background. And the challenge now is, I'll give you an example. So at Redeemer, we had an after-school program, and it was primarily African-American children. And one time, there were 2 Hmong children that started coming to the after-school program. And I was elated. I thought, oh, we've arrived. We have African-American and now we have Hmong children. And I was just, my chest was coming out. It was a great accomplishment. And then one day, during the after-school program, a gentleman came in, a Hmong gentleman came in, and he was sweating profusely, and he was all upset. And he asked if anybody had seen his children, and he described his children, and they were participating with our after-school program. And I was feeling so good. I had the solution to his problem. And I said, "Oh, your children, they're upstairs, with our after-school program." And he just looked at me almost in tears, and he said, "How could you? How could you have my children in your after-school program, and you didn't ask me?" That's a conflicting worldview, right? And so it's the challenge of learning to honor one another, learning one another's cultures, learning how to, the equity of true relationship and partnership. And that's a real challenge for our organizations and our institutions. And that's the reason things like the Intercultural Development Inventory, there's something called asset-based community development, but those tools, they help us to slow down, reflect on ourselves, and to be more authentically in relationship, and sharing our organizations and the embrace of our organizations. And so much of it is about learning how to be in true authentic relationship and awareness of the systems that we have been acculturated to and benefit from, and not to the benefit of a larger community. Dan, back at you.
Okay. So has PK talked, when we think about worldview, another word for that, worldview is kind of a big concept around culture, which is what we talk about a lot and what we help people work with. Both, and I would say I come back to, particularly for the white organizations that we work with, coming at a point of understanding their own culture, and in PK's words, understanding the worldview that we have been enculturated with since our ancestors. And, PK said it a number of times, there's one worldview, is not better than another worldview. And I think I struggled with this the first time that PK was describing it, because I could very much recognize the acquisition worldview in myself. It was very clear that acquiring at least enough money and income to feel secure about myself and my family, enough education, to feel like, a lot of my self-worth was built around this. And I became critical of it. The more I learned about worldviews and different worldviews, I could become very critical about it. And then I started to do more homework and try to become more compassionate, and to myself as well. And realizing that, there are reasons for these worldviews. And you think about a lot of white Europeans, they have the Scandinavian background, and that acquiring things for the coming winter is actually pretty important. Otherwise, you're going to die. You're going to freeze to death. It's when the worldview of acquisition becomes the only thing that matters, and it happens at the expense of relationship, and at the expense of respecting elders and so forth, and other cultural points of view, that it does harm. And so the work we do with organizations is to really help people grow their cultural self-awareness at a very personal level. What were we taught, and when were we taught it, and how has it shaped our attitudes towards others, particularly others who are not like us, and to help uncover that, and then to develop some level of competence to dial it back, or to at least change it so that you're not doing harm. If you want to work with people who are different in different cultures with different worldviews, we've got to respect those other worldviews. I can't come in with my worldview about the value of time and be a real stickler about staying on track with a meeting, or getting frustrated when people don't show up on time, when in fact they're valuing more the relationships that are going to happen, and less so the time, adherence to a time schedule. So that's one very small way that is really, if you look at Black churches and white churches, that's a big difference, is how long things last, and how regimented it is, versus how free and relationship based it is. And so the work we do with organizations and individuals is really helping people to understand their own culture, and then once they're starting to get a handle on that, appreciating the differences in other cultures. And not all differences are things that we're going to agree with. With the African immigrant community, there's a lot of strong values around gender roles that are different than where we've landed with here in our progressive white culture here. So how do we do that? If we're going to come alongside and work collaboratively with African immigrants, we've got to work with them and in dialogue, and not dismiss or judge these other worldviews. We've got to sort of come alongside and be in dialogue. I think PK said about relationship is so important, and it's really everything starts and ends.
Dan, can I give an example, and then maybe we can open it up for questions?
Great.
So what we've learned at CLNE, as we've been involved with the light rail planning, right? And so incorporating to the community what will be happening with light rail or voter registration, and recognizing that so often in the community that we're working with in North Minneapolis, there's low turnout, and there seems to be a lack of involvement or investment. And what we learned from that is that people don't imagine that whatever those processes are really not, they're not really being built to benefit them. And so there's a lack of involvement in the process. And so what we learned to do is on the front end that, not begin by making it about light rail or voter registration, but bringing people into relationship. And so inviting people to cookouts or places where people gather, and then share the meeting around relationship, around those common places of common ground. And then once people feel listened to, people feel seen, then they're more likely to engage in the process. So what we typically do, and I would say historically and in the white community, people have a sense of entitlement that they know that in investing in the process, they're going to benefit from it. They own homes. So those higher rates of home ownership, equity, all of those things, that there are people who grow up with a sense of knowing that wealth happens out of owning homes. And there's all these systems that have been placed for years, the spread of urbanization and suburban neighborhoods, all those things. So people that grew up knowing that about home ownership, building equity for wealth, they show up for those meetings that are planning for light rail or voter registration. Was a lot of people don't show up because they don't believe in the system. They don't believe that the system is actually set up for them. And so, and I'm really saying this as a suggestion to the League of Women Voters, as I'm also saying this to the church: invest on the front end of relationship with people, that they are valued, that they're cared for, that the process is for them. And then it's out of that sense of relationship that people are more likely to actually engage and trust in the process. So I think that we've got about 14 minutes or so. So this would be a good time to invite your questions or comments. Unless, Dan, you have anything.
No, I'd love to hear from this wonderful group.
Don't all go at once.
Okay, I have a question. This is Ellen Archibald. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It has been suggested at various times that our league group here in Minneapolis try to ally ourselves with groups with comparable interests. And of course, I've talked with several people who are on this phone call about this. How do we find such other groups? I mean, I may be approaching it in the wrong way, not having fully realized your distinction between worldviews. And I appreciate that. Thank you. But can you suggest how people steeped in a property acquisition lifetime, I can think about trying to build relationships, but I don't know that I immediately come across that way when I make a very, my very best effort. I'm really trying, and I'm not sure it comes across as either genuine or, well, you probably get my problem. I'm not sure how I can relate to people from different worldviews, and how we as an organization in Minneapolis can reach out. If we suppose we found a group, I just pick a community, the Somali community, I imagine, has a variety of groups. Suppose we found a name and called and said, gosh, we'd love to work with you on getting all of your people out, especially the women, out to vote. And I don't know whether they would welcome our asking that. Have you any ideas?
I think I maybe have two responses. One is, remember that it's a marathon rather than a race, right? And that the commitment to be in relationship doesn't begin, on the 15th of October to get people to vote the first Tuesday in November. And so thinking about relationship begins much earlier. And the other thing I would say is we're talking about more than 400-year history of distrust for systems. And so the relational part of that, the challenge is to be authentic in relationship. And people, well, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, Kitty Stratton.
Hi,
Ellen, she was just
what?
microphone is on. Yeah.
Am I- Hello?
We can hear you, Kitty.
Yeah,
Do you have
we
a
hear you fine.
question?
It's a kind of a question, well, it's a comment. So you all believe in diversity and equity and inclusion, but look around where you live. Look around at your friends. Do you really believe in diversity? Do you live diversity? Do you go to places where there's an incredibly diverse community? But first of all, look at where you live. Do you know the most segregated part of Minneapolis? It's not anywhere in North Minneapolis. It's where the upper middle class community lives. So if you believe in diversity, then first see how you can live it yourself. Okay, I'm done.
Well, I want to make a comment about, I hear you, Kitty. And so I'm a Black person. I live in South Minneapolis. I moved to Minneapolis 7 years ago. And as Dan was saying, he didn't really understand the communities. I didn't understand the communities. When I would come to Minneapolis for work, I was working on this side of town. These are the neighborhoods that I saw. And I decided to live here, which doesn't mean for me that I can't be interactive with people of color or any kinds of people. It doesn't mean that. So I think that relationships, I don't go to church here in Minneapolis. I haven't gone to a church. I mean, I've gone to some churches, but I haven't gone to church because I don't connect necessarily with the worship that I find here in South Minneapolis, and or I haven't found a place that I want to worship with anywhere here. So I'm just saying that it doesn't preclude you, it is relationships. And myself, I have been struggling to develop those relationships. And I have developed relationships in South Minneapolis with African-American people. So I don't know, I volunteered at a school with mostly African-American young women, pregnant girls. So I think that we develop relationships on different levels. And I think there are a lot of school teachers in the League of Women Voters. I think there have been. And those school teachers have, the ones that I have talked with and shared with, have done work with those communities and develop relationships and try to put forth. But I also at the same time, I'm rambling here, but I do think that it's bigger, and it has been 400 years, and it's going to take a lot of work. And Minneapolis in particular, where they did not have the same experience as, say, people in Georgia or in the South with a larger African-American community. They didn't have that experience. And I wrote a letter when I first came here about that. And Minneapolis is it's a puzzle. And so many white people say to me, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Well, how would you know? You weren't taught it. You live in a silo. And I'm talking about the whole state, because there's, the largest population. I mean, there's not even, it's a very small population of people of color. And it has changed drastically in the last, 20 years? And you're still trying to learn. So I don't know, Reverend Kelly. It's a difficult path. And I think what you did with that prayer tent, the meetings that we had every morning, those were invaluable. People I know, some of my family joined that meeting from across the country. And I think it was an opening for people to hear, like you said, from a voice that hadn't been heard.
Mhm.
And in terms of the league, we are still struggling about how we can have more people of color in the League of Women Voters in Minneapolis. And I struggle with that because I ask people, and as you said, they don't see the connection. They don't see how they could participate with the league. So
Hey,
it's
Diane, if I could say something to you. So everything I said was, so I just am reading this book, Nice Racism, and all of the things that she says in the first part of this book, I mean, I answered wrong to them, but she brings up so many good things about, I live in North Minneapolis. I struggle to have diverse relationships. Even though I have more diverse relationships now than I ever have. So it's really taking, and that comment wasn't aimed at you.
no,
Because
absolutely not. I know.
I was gonna say, because you're the diversity in your community, but when she started asking the questions in that book, I'm like, oh my God, I answered wrong to that. So, it's basically taking inventory of how you're living your life and what kinds of relationships you have. And why don't you have different, and not you, Diane, but why don't we have?
I think in Minneapolis too, in Minnesota, and I could be wrong about this because I really tried to study this since I've been here informally.
tough.
People have very large families. And they have those relationships, and they're very close sometimes, relationship, not purposely, not intentionally trying to not let other people in, but it's the culture. They have a lot of large families. They don't necessarily think they need more friends.
And Kitty and Diane, I'm going to cut in now because this is going to be great discussion at our unit meetings. We've got a few more questions. And Jane, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to ask a very acquisition-oriented question. I think you guys said you do like consulting to businesses and groups and things like that. So from a practical standpoint, if you were to go into a business who said, we tend to hire like ourselves and we have no diversity, what are the practical things that how do you tell an organization like that to start making changes and doing things, and what steps do you sort of coach them to start taking?
Well, I don't know about business as much as nonprofits or churches. And I think that what I would ask them is, how's that working for you? And so in the demographics of the United States, that homogeneous, traditionally white oriented culture organization, it's kind of a losing proposition as the United States is growing more and more diverse. And corporations have been dealing with this for 20 years and recognizing that they're not as strong as they used to be in terms of their profits or whatever that might be. So I would begin with that. And there's an awareness, I think a very strong awareness of businesses that they need to adapt in order to be to benefit from a population that's significant. And as Diane mentioned, I was shocked. I lived in Chicago and moved back to Minnesota in 2000. I was shocked at how much more diverse Minneapolis had become in the 5 years that I'd been away. So I don't know that that's answering your question directly, but businesses are pretty clear about their self-interest. And if they can see that their self-interest is in being more diverse, they're going to have to deal. They're going to deal with that.
If I could chime in just a bit, in the culture work that we do, PK mentioned the IDI, or the Intercultural Development Inventory, as a tool that we use with groups. And there's a whole framework, but organizations can easily be in what we call minimization, where they focus only on what's common, what's the common ground they have among people. And what tends to happen with a lot of largely dominant white organizations is that's the culture, that becomes the culture that people of color need to assimilate into in order to succeed in the organization. And that has a very high cost for people. And for people of color who are going to, they feel like they've got to leave part of themselves behind day after day after day. They're used to not being listened to or seen. And that's the challenge that an organization has to deal with head on, to understand what is it about their own culture that doesn't seem to welcome other kinds of voices and other kinds of gifts that they bring. And I don't think there's any trick to it other than to be aware that that is a reality, and then to be in dialogue. And if you bring a diverse person in, diverse people in, listen to them, because they're going to see things that an organization leaders don't see because they've been swimming in that water forever. So it's like, just listen, ask questions and listen. And what's the other thing we haven't talked about yet, PK, is live with the tension. There's going to be tension. There's going to be disruption. And I think our gut reaction is to avoid it, is to smooth it over. That's a Minnesota nice thing. To live with the tension in a belief that there's something better on the other side. That's a core, I think, practice for us to work with.
And Diane, you could also point to, look at the healthcare industry, look at the airline industry, look at those industries that was set up in exploiting or not regarding their employees, and the backlash that they're dealing with right now in terms of the vulnerability of those industries.
All right, Deborah Jindra, you have a question. You need to unmute.
Sorry about that. We had some fairly successful Healthy Legacy forums a few years ago, and each one of those had an arts component and a food component, and it brought out a lot of people. And I'm just wondering what our speakers think about including, in every one of those, we had various subjects like police reform and climate change and things. But first we thought about how to include arts in a connection to those, and also having some kind of food that would bring people together so that they were, discussing the issues in a comfortable place.
I would say the things like food, art, they're almost like languages, and that common language. So the more you do those things and people gather around food, around art, it provides a better access point than the point of access where it's based on who knows the most, or where there can be a disparity in the relationship if it's based on someone who's the container of the knowledge and imparting that to somebody else. But where we begin with relationship, and I don't care what organization or what institution you're in, when you can begin at that place of common ground and then build from there, I think that's a statement of equity. And so I would commend your organization for investing in those kinds of gatherings, almost like a building block. And when I think of that, I think if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then you begin with that basic sense of belonging, and then moving from there into maybe the more complexity of communication and higher levels of investment, I would say. But the bottom line is, I would really encourage doing more of that. And that's something that CLNE, we try to do, is how can we gather in ways that establish relationship. And Healing Our City, when we gathered for those 79 days during the Chauvin trial, we began with music and a time of reflection, and that 9 minutes and 29 seconds of silence. And one of the things, Dan became kind of a rock star because Dan is really good with music and he loves music. And you could see Dan on the Zoom kind of moving around, and the quality of the music. Really, that established a rapport and a regard for Dan with many people who didn't have a clue who Dan was. But that communication through that music transcended a lot of those barriers, and out it sees something in somebody that kind of pulls it into relationship.
I'll just put this question to both of you, thinking about our organization, the League of Women Voters Minneapolis. Can you tell us some people you think we should hear from?
Go for it, Dan.
Oh, man.
Well, I'll jump in first, Dan, if you don't.
Yeah, I'll think
So,
about it.
one I would say is Nakima Levy Armstrong. She's an activist, and she's a person of passion and commitment to community. She would be on top of my list of people. I would say Jody Harpstead,
Yeah.
the commissioner. She would also be really good. Paul Slack, who is a vice president at Lutheran Social Services. I'll keep going, Dan. Jump in there.
Oh, you're naming all the people that I was going to name, so let's go with that.
Great,
Yeah,
thank
Paul
you.
would be wonderful. Yeah.
And I would say a couple of young people, particularly BIPOC young people. There's a poet, Joe Davis, great. He's a young spoken word poet. It would be wonderful. And tune into our come together on the 15th. The two young people there, in particular, Manny Lewis grew up from North Minneapolis. He's amazing. Just kind of a natural talent, communicator. Invest in some of those, because there's so many voices that have not been heard, and we're lost for it because they're incredible young people. And if you can hear them, they can be the portal for understanding more young people. If we would figure out how to communicate with them, that could really open the door to their interests. You know, everybody wants to be involved. Everybody wants to be engaged. But you have to get through that barrier of all those ways that people feel like they've got messages that they're really that the women league, the League of Women Voters isn't really interested in.
Could I ask a question, Reverend Chapman? Is there a window, or is there an opportunity to for the league to participate in any way in your monthly meetings, or a 5-minute or 1 minute? So quote, I'm going to use the word commercial about voting. I mean, we are nonpartisan, so we wouldn't be talking about that, but I'm just wondering if there is an opportunity.
Yeah, and I'll Dan, but I would invite that you would be one of our reflection leaders, one of our Thursdays, to talk about the League of Women Voters and your experience in Minnesota. You would be a rock star.
Think so too. And PK, when we next week, when we've got Manny and Kendrick there, they've been working on voter registration in the community,
Mm.
it would be good to hear from them about what messages are they picking up from the community, from people that they interact with about voting.
We could talk about that. And I'll certainly be there, but.
Yeah, if you could join us, Diane, and then you can ask some really good questions and be a part of that.
Yeah, I also would volunteer my wife, who's involved with the St. Paul NAACP. You know, I would say many, if not most, African Americans are voters. We're talking about the disenfranchised African American or people of color that are less likely to vote because they don't feel like the system is set up for them. But I think probably African Americans are a really high percentage of voters for those who are, how do I say this, who feel like the system in some way either works for them and or could or should be working for them.
I think the one thing that we want to do is reach the youth, those people turning 18 that are eligible to vote, the young people in the African American Hmong community, any of the communities of color in Minnesota. I think it's the young people and if you look around at all of us, there's a few young people on, one or two young people on this call, but most of us are older. So that was just a statement, I guess.
I think you all should, you all want to participate on the program that we have this month. I think it's the third Thursday. I believe that's the 15th.
Yep.
It will be a program of particular interest to you. They're young people and they're both involved in voter registration work.
The one name I'll throw on there too is a woman named Brenda Blackhawk, who's resident of North Minneapolis. She's Native American and has done quite a lot of work in voting rights, particularly for people that have been incarcerated. And I think she would have a good point of view for you. She's younger too.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Glenna, do you have a question?
It's actually more of a comment. Liz, I participated in those mornings after George Floyd was killed. I can't remember the name that you just talked about. And I was so sad when they ended because I got such benefit from them. And I just wanted them to go on forever. And I realized that nothing goes on forever. But I'm thrilled to learn about Thursday evenings.
Mhm.
And so I have already registered for the 15th.
Oh, great.
Wonderful.
So I'm excited about what you're doing. And at the same time, I just think the challenges are very daunting for many of the things, you know, that Diane mentioned. I had the same experience, have had the same experience. It's at some level, it's not even a question of whether you're white or black or Hmong or Somali or whatever. It's you're not Norwegian. You know, this is culturally a very closed community. And it just takes a lot. And I thank you for what you've done and for what you're doing. And I hope we can find meaningful ways to partner.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Gwen Myers.
Quick experience. The league, of course, is focused on issues. And what is it? Probably almost 15 years ago, the issue was photo ID. And I had an occasion to address a group of young Black men on the subject of photo ID. And you can bet they were really excited to hear about this 70-year-old lady telling them about photo ID. However, I did ask them how many had driver's licenses, and everybody raised his hand. And then I said, how many of you have a driver's license with an accurate address on it? And almost everybody's hand went down. And I said, you will not be allowed to vote if this bill passes. And I told them like 25 to 30% of Black Americans would be disenfranchised by photo ID. And they were interested right away, and they wanted to know what the league was doing about it. But I think if we go to communities, and when Vivian Jenkins Nelson Jenkins was president of the league, I tell you, the league board meetings did not start with a box lunch. We had catered meals for the board meetings. But you know, so we can do the cultural things, but we've got issues, and this democracy is in danger of failing. I mean, the end is literally in sight. And how to explain that to the population in general eludes me at the moment.
Yeah. So Gwen, I want to commend you for having met with those young people. And I also want to say part of what we need to do is when those young people answer the question that so few of them had accurate addresses on their license, driver's license, to be curious and ask them, well, why is it that their address was wrong? And that curiosity, I think, leads to the fact of how many times have those young people moved, which points to housing stability or instability. And so as the League of Women Voters, what of our interest didn't stop at whether or not they vote, but the conditions that lead to the stability in their community. So how might the League of Women Voters be in alliance with affordable housing or other organizations that are addressing those disparities in the community that cause so many young people to move so many times in a year, right? Or so the connection is to not just for the League of Women Voters, but for our society and our leadership to pay more attention to human lives and not just the issue of whether or not they vote.
Kitty,
Back to what Gwen said, we're on a cliff. So how do we, is it going to take going over the cliff when we can all come together and be in one relationship? But how we need to kind of do both things, because I'm not a fearful person, but I really am fearful that because the voter disenfranchisement after this next election, it's possible that we aren't even going to be able to do anything about it. So we've got this urgency on the one hand, and building relationships, which take forever on the other hand. How can we do something urgent? Does that make sense?
Well, it does to me, and that these are scary times. January 6th is a scary reality. Pretty much everything that I hear, the extreme of some of our politics, it's scary. And I guess for me, the question, we may be going over the cliff. The question is, will we go over together or will we go over apart? And I'm not even assuming that we're going to go over the cliff, right? But the question is, are we going to, wherever we go, are we going to go together or not?
all right. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to say a huge thank you to Kelly and Dan for meeting with us tonight. And Yeah, applause for them. For those of you who joined late, they are with the Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement. And we had some technical difficulties at the start of tonight's presentation, including that I forgot to hit the record button during my introduction. So I wanted to make sure, and their website will have the information about the event on Thursday, the 15th, which we've been speaking about. So Center for Leadership and Neighborhood Engagement. Thanks again for speaking with us. So grateful, and we learned a lot. Good night, and hope to see you.
I just want to say thank you. Dan and I hold the League of Women Voters in great esteem. And so it was an honor to have this opportunity to present to you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you. Thanks for the work that you do.
I want to say one more thing that about this is Ann McLaughlin and I, this came about with conversations with Ann McLaughlin and myself. So Ann was, we operate together most of the time in our ideas. And so Ann said in one of our conversations, we should have CL&E to come and talk to us. So I just wanted to make that point. So I wanted to make that clear to everyone.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, and good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.